This is the third lecture for week 8 in Hospital 121, and this lecture will look at friendship and peer acceptance during the middle childhood years. Specifically, we'll look at a few different types of relationships with peers. We'll look at friendships, groups, and also peer acceptance and rejection, and how that's studied by researchers and what influences peer acceptance and rejection. So first, we've already talked about peers in week 3, just briefly, as a powerful agent of socialization. So actually, children socialize each other, as well as adults socializing children. And one way that children socialize each other is through the sociocultural method of peer pressure. So you remember our different methods of socialization from week 3. Peer pressure is about getting someone to conform to a norm, so a type of behavior that's expected by the group. So of course, you can all remember being a child and feeling like you need to do something, whether it's wear a particular article of clothing or act in a certain way because of peer pressure. So that is one powerful way that peers socialize each other. And children have different kinds of relationships with their peers, and an important relationship is friendship. And friendship really comes on in the middle childhood years when children gravitate towards certain other peers and form friendships with them. So friendship is about it's about providing social support to someone and intimacy between equals. And children's capacity to have friendships changes as they get older. So with preschoolers, they tend to choose their friends based on common interests and getting along well, so liking to play with the similar types of things. And as children get older in the school-age years, they continue wanting to have friends who have similar interests and that they get along well with, but also who have psychological characteristics that they appreciate, like being trustworthy and being helpful. And then adolescents are seeking greater intimacy in their friendships. So we'll start talking about that when we talk about adolescence, but there's a shift in terms of what we expect from friendships based on our developmental level. But in general, children and even adolescents tend to be friends with people who have a similar kind of background to them, and children tend to be, particularly when they're young, they tend to gravitate towards friends who are their same sex. So they tend to have closer, more friends and more intimate friendships with, girls with girls and boys with boys. So if you think back to your own experience in middle childhood, I'm sure you would agree that having friendships is a big benefit for children in terms of their development in middle childhood. And children benefit from having good friendships. They're more likely to feel good about themselves. That's, having good self-esteem, our positive feelings about ourselves. Children are less likely to be lonely or depressed, and that may make them feel more positively towards school. So children tend to have more positive feelings about school if they have a friend at school to spend time with. And children who have friends act more pro-socially. So you remember pro-social is something we talked about. Behavior is something we talked about last week in early childhood. So pro-social behavior benefits others as well as the self. And then children with friends also have a way of coping with stress. So having a friend is a good way to deal with stress, to talk it out, and that's associated with resiliency and coping with adversity that we've talked about previously. But friendship can also bring risks. So the reading talks about how children can reinforce each other's aggressive and risky behaviors. And we'll talk more about that when we talk about adolescence, how adolescents can pressure each other into risky behaviors, or, just through the friendships they have, children want to join in. And then this thing that was explored in your reading around co-rumination. So children, when they co-ruminate, they spend time discussing each other's personal problems. And, if it can put children at greater risk of depression and anxiety if they're talking about their problems all the time and kind of wallowing a bit in psychological problems with friends. So, but in general, there's no question that having friends is important in middle childhood, and it benefits children in terms of their development. So in middle childhood, and particularly moving into adolescence, children not only have friends, they often will have cliques where they'll have a small group of friends who are similar to themselves in terms of their attitudes, and then often, have similarities in terms of being the same sex, being of the same racial ethnic background, being the same age, and they spend time with this small group of children when they're at school. And some children are part of a crowd, and a crowd is a larger group of children. Often, those labels that you might think of, like being in the jocks, or being, with the drama kids, or, in the band. There's often a larger group that may be a mixed sex group, particularly moving into adolescence, where children spend their time not just with a small, tight-knit group of friends, but with a larger group that they have some kind of association with. So children, when they're part of groups or cliques, and they're among classmates in school, there's the dynamic of popularity and rejection. And we'll talk more about how researchers study this, but children may be considered popular by their peers, may be accepted by a lot of peers, and having a network of friends and being popular among other children provides children and adolescents with an opportunity to be assertive, to act in leadership types of roles. So your reading talks about kind of group dominance and how some children will naturally assume a leadership role with other children. And it also gives children an opportunity to practice conflict resolution skills. So when children have these sort of networks of people that they interact with, it can be positive in terms of having opportunities for social development. But peer rejection can also happen, and peer rejection can have a lot of negative consequences. So peer rejection is a risk factor for school dropout. You can imagine if a child thinks they're rejected and disliked by their peers, they're less likely to want to go to school. And that can then lead to having antisocial types of behaviors, not pro-social behaviors. So pro-social behaviors being those that help others or are beneficial socially in some way. Then antisocial behaviors where children are getting involved in crime in some way. It's associated with being rejected by peers. And then mental health issues like depression and anxiety are also associated with being rejected by peers. So it certainly is a risk factor for other outcomes. Researchers who are interested in looking at children's relationships with their peers often use sociometrics to study those relationships. So thinking back to our second class about research methods, it's a particular method for measuring social relationships. It really relies on, it's a kind of self-report method, but it asks children to identify their preferences or their likes or dislikes of their classmates. And there are different techniques that can be used. So one is to nominate. So a researcher would say, tell me about the 3 children you like best in your class. Now tell me the 3 children you like the least in your class. Or they might give the children a sheet of paper with all the names of children in their classroom and then ask them to rate them, if you like them from 1 to 5. Or another method would be to give a paired comparison. So between Susie and Joey, who do you like, and who do you like best? So these are all different methods these are all fall within sociometrics as a method for finding out from children how they relate to their peers. So using those sociometric techniques that I just described, numerous studies have been done and to ask children, particularly in middle childhood years, what they think of other children in their class. And these studies have identified 5 categories of peer status, which appear somewhat stable over time, meaning that if you are ranked in one of these 5 descriptors, you tend to be ranked that way again if the study is repeated with your group at a later point. So the children who get the positive votes are the ones that are liked by other children, and then the ones who get negative votes are the ones that are disliked by other children. So starting in the upper right corner, popular children are liked by a lot of children and disliked by few children. So these are, again, most classmates like the child. Then the opposite of that is rejected. So then rejected children are mostly disliked, so they have few positive votes and many negative votes. Controversial children, there's a divide, so they get lots of children who like them and lots of children who dislike them. And then neglected children, many classmates, they're sort of ignored, so they're not liked by very many children, but they're not disliked by very many children. And then average children just sort of sit in the middle somewhere, so they get an average number of counts. They're liked and disliked by some classmates. So average children are actually considered like a baseline by which we compare other children. So there's sort of less, it's not about characterizing those children. Those children have basically average social competence, but then using that to kind of measure other children. So as your reading points out, we know the most about popular children and rejected children, although I take issue with something they say about popular children. So popular children are really, they're the well-liked children. And so these children, research has tended to find that there's a correlation with having good problem-solving skills, positive social interactions, having good friendship skills. Now, controversial children, your reading says that they're a type of popular children, and it's true that they are often considered the popular kids. But in this regard, I want you to think about in sociometrics that popular, in what I just said, is about being well-liked, whereas popular, in terms of the way we think of the popular girls, sometimes those girls are controversial, or those boys. So controversial children can be children that engage in relational aggression, which I'll talk about in a minute. They're children who are often really socially aggressive, but they have skills and are respected by others. And so they're liked by a lot of children, but they're disliked by a lot of children. They may even be feared. So it's those controversial kids where that's somewhat of a less consistent group in terms of these studies, but I'm sure you can bring to mind a child who was that kind of controversial kid where kids respect them but fear them. Neglected children tend to be the loner type of kids where they're socially uninvolved and they like to do things on their own. And rejected children tend to have two subtypes: the aggressive type of child, which sometimes can be the bully type of child, and the withdrawn child, a child who doesn't really engage very much and doesn't have sort of skills in terms of engaging with friends and being friends. So some socially rejected children are aggressive, and there's different kinds of aggression. So your reading talks about instrumental aggression being a kind of specific aggression that's around one particular goal. A hostile aggression is often what we think about when we think about bullies, where we think about intimidation, harassment, maybe that has a physical quality to it. And then relational aggression is a kind of aggression that's often associated with and practiced by girls in their relationships, where children, the children are, and particularly girls, are trying to hurt each other by undermining social relationships, where they're using exclusion, for example, or gossip to hurt a child. So, of course, being the chronic victim of bullying has a lot of negative repercussions for children. So children who experience a lot of bullying, whether of the relational aggression kind or the hostile or instrumental, have low self-esteem, tend to dislike school, and are often lonely and depressed. And children who are at risk of being bullied or being socially rejected are children who are either aggressive themselves. So children who are bullies may be victimized by other children, by other bullies, or may be rejected by their peers. And then children who are withdrawn and submissive may become the target of bullies and also are more likely to be socially rejected by peers. So your reading talks about research that's looked at how parenting is associated with peer rejection. And there's research that correlates, because you can't, again, prove this causally since we can't redistribute children to different parents in an experimental model. But just looking at correlations, where you look at patterns and you look at why certain children are rejected by peers, and then you look at their families, that kind of research has shown that peer rejection, children who experience peer rejection, tend to have parenting that models poor emotional regulation. So that's where parents are, when they have some kind of conflict, they're belligerent or they're combative or they're aggressive, and children are learning to be like that when they interact with others. when children get inconsistent discipline. So children are, not being always corrected in terms of their behaviors. So that could be around being permissive or just some kind of inconsistency around trying to regulate children's behaviors. And then also associated with low responsiveness or warmth, which we talked about in terms of parenting styles. And that's associated with the authoritarian and the neglectful kind of parenting. So there is some connection there between parenting and how children are with their peers. This is a graphic that I showed you in week 3 about attachment and internal working models of relationships from the reader on page 127. So if you remember, this graphic basically shows that the secure attachment that children form in infancy then can lead to good peer relationships in middle childhood and intimate friendships in adolescence, and that's a time when intimacy becomes more important and children form deeper relationships. And then children form emotionally positive romantic relationships in early childhood. So this sort of has the arrow going through. And it's not that linear, but again, there is a relationship there in terms of parenting and security of attachment and other kinds of relationships like relationships with peers. So part of that comes from feelings of positive self-worth and how children think of others. So you remember that we talked about the internal working model being about how one perceives the self and others, the self as being worthy of love and others as being worthy of trust. And so children who are more aggressive tend to be have more perceptions of others as being hostile, particularly in ambiguous situations. So if children are interpreting the behavior of others as being hostile, they may be more aggressive towards others. So that's a way that the internal working model of relationships comes up in peer relationships, is that if children don't have security in their attachment relationships in infancy, and they distrust others, it can cause them to think of others as acting hostile, and that can create a kind of aggression. And finally, what social skills are important in terms of being accepted by peers and forming friendships? It's important to note here that children can learn skills to become better friends and to be more accepted by peers. And so that's an important way that adults can work with children, like social workers can work with children who are experiencing peer rejection to help them form better social skills. And so children who are able to initiate social interactions and relationships, like they have skills in terms of making new friends or able to initiate joining a group of children in an activity, maintaining social interactions and relationships where they can keep up a conversation or help a friend in need or play cooperatively and not be aggressive or try to take control. And then managing conflict. So how do you handle things when there's inevitably going to be conflict in all relationships? So how do you handle that? And do you handle that without using kind of overt aggression? Do you handle it in a cooperative way? So that's where we'll leave things for this week, having discussed the family relationship and siblings and schools and peers as all being influences in middle childhood.